I've got to tell you, I've never had my own Netflix account. Never saw the point of it, frankly. Girlfriends, roommates, family members, they always had their own account that I inevitably got the password for eventually. So if I ever wanted to use the service, I always had access to it. But I can count the number of times that I've opened up Netflix for my own purposes on one hand. Sometimes Naomi might want to watch something on it, and sometimes I might join her. But if it's just me by myself, I rank Netflix down somewhere near cable TV as something that I want to actually spend my spare time on. That's not to say that Netflix doesn't have good content on it, or at least had good content on it at one point, considering how much stuff has left the platform over the years. But even now, do you want to watch Seinfeld, Friends, Star Trek The Next Generation? Disregarding Netflix originals for now, the Netflix backlog is still formidable, even nowadays. And I guess the idea of that backlog is always what Netflix seemed to be about for me as a millennial, and also why I never cared about the service. I grew up in an era of the internet that is pre-video streaming, where if you wanted episodes of an anime or a TV show, you would download it on a file sharing program, and hope that you didn't accidentally click on Dragon Ball Z episode 10.mp4.exe with a file size of 212 kilobytes. The episodes that you did get would have a resolution of about 100 pixels across, and the audio sounded like it was recorded in a cymbal factory. But hey, it was free. And before Pornhub, this is how people shared porn too, though those files were a lot more likely to contain viruses, or have some really weird shit on them. Anybody else remember downloading an X-rated video when you discovered that it was a relabeled Faces of Death video? Yeah, thanks anonymous internet troll from 20 years ago. However, it's not like video content was relegated to file sharing and later BitTorrent because people didn't know what streaming was. It was actually because of a lack of tech. The concept of streaming media was actually invented in 1881, no joke. The French company Theaterphone saw the possibilities of merging primitive recording and playback technologies with the then new telephone to provide a service where operas and stage productions could be transmitted over the phone to people who couldn't be there physically. By 1890, the tech was adapted to create the telephone newspaper, where you could listen to the news of the day over the phone. By 1920, the tech was adapted again to create Muzak, by the company literally called Muzak, to provide generic background music for grocery stores and elevators, again transmitted over telephone. The creator of Muzak, George Squire, dubbed his technology and its ancestors, Theaterphone and telephone newspaper, continuous streaming, to contrast it with the then significantly more expensive and temperamental radio technology. Radio was wireless and omnidirectional, allowing anybody with the proper equipment to tune in, but back then that equipment was very expensive and not likely to work. Meanwhile, streaming was more reliable and higher quality, but it required a physical hookup to the network. Eventually, as radio tech became more commercially viable, the concept of directly streaming media to the end user mostly died off in the 1930s, with the exception of a live jukebox service in Philadelphia that was controlled remotely by an operator in the 60s and 70s. And also except for Muzak. That's still going strong today, and where would we be without it? The point I'm making is, the idea of having content stored in one location and then streamed to users in another location, rather than having to have the content at the user's location, is an idea that has been around for a very long time, but we just haven't had the technology to do it cheaply, until YouTube. And even then, YouTube still loses money, but that's nothing like the theoretical money pit that would have been a 1990s YouTube. YouTube showed the world that streaming could work with the modern internet tech, at least modern for 2006. The key word being could, because many a YouTube competitor have bit the dust or languished in obscurity trying to do what YouTube does without the financial backing of Google. Some of you Zoomers might not know this, but Netflix didn't start as a video streaming service. It began as a mail-order DVD rental service instead in August of 1997, back before video streaming was technologically viable. The OGs of Netflix, Mark Randolph, Reed Hastings, and Patty McCord, were all in a carpool group together in Silicon Valley working for a different company, where they spitballed the idea of a VHS mailing service. It turned out that videotapes were too fragile to be shipped through the mail, with all of their intricate parts and delicate magnetic tape. But DVDs, which had come out only a few months before, proved to be sturdy enough to survive a trip with the US Postal Service, after they actually mailed a test disc between Randolph and Hastings' houses. And so the gang decided to leave their jobs and start Netflix as a DVD rental service. And hey, if for some reason you still like physical media like that, you can still have Netflix ship DVDs to you. Here's what Netflix.com looked like back in the day. Wild, isn't it? They did the $4.99 per movie rental thing, same as the brick and mortar stores like Blockbuster Video, but eventually they transitioned to a subscription service. One monthly fee, pick your DVDs, they'll be shipped right to your door. Netflix famously asked Blockbuster to buy them out in the early days, but Blockbuster refused, with its CEO thinking that the internet was just a passing phase. That would basically be the final nail in the coffin for Blockbuster, as the brick and mortar video rental store model had significantly more overhead than Netflix. Blockbuster's final gasp was to spin up a service called Blockbuster Total Access, which was basically identical to Netflix's mail rental service. But it was too little too late. Blockbuster implemented this in 2007, the same year that Netflix transitioned away from that very same model and into the video streaming business. I don't think I need to segue into a boomer nostalgia rant about Blockbuster, do I? I'm sure YouTube is filled with people talking about Blockbuster memes, or how they spent their best Friday evenings of their lives looking for the ideal N64 game to rent or something like that. You all know what's going on. Also, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't point out Redbox. Redbox appeared to fill the void that Netflix and Blockbuster left behind, but rather than deal with mailing DVDs or brick-and-mortar stores, Redbox placed video rental vending machines in high-traffic locations, like malls and grocery stores. That, coupled with the ability to return a rental to any kiosk, not specifically the one that you rented it from, led to Redbox's success. Even now in 2022, they're still limping along because the service is convenient for older people who don't know how to use new technology. That's basically what Netflix sold, and still sells too: convenience. To somebody like me, turning on a BitTorrent program might be no problem, but for most people, convenience is something that they're willing to pay for. Netflix's rise would only continue after Blockbuster fell by the wayside. At this point in Netflix's story, the 7th console generation was swinging into gear. That's the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii era, by the way. And again, for those of you who don't remember, oh god, I'm old, this shit was happening when I was in university, how could time be so fleeting? This generation of the video game console war saw companies duke it out not only over video games, but also over dominance of the living room. The PlayStation 2, including a built-in DVD player, was what helped DVD become the dominant format of the 2000s, and Sony was hoping to replicate that success in the 2010s by including a Blu-ray disc player in the PS3. Meanwhile, the Xbox 360 supported the competing HD DVD format by Toshiba, but unlike the PS3, the 360 didn't actually have one built into it. You had to buy one of these things and plug it into your 360. Man, does anyone remember these things? You can get them nowadays as a paperweight for like $3. At the same time, Microsoft was also developing Silverlight, a framework for streaming media, implementing it on both Windows and the 360. Silverlight would be the same tech that Netflix would eventually use for its own in-browser streaming too. In terms of console dominance, Microsoft had it made. The 360 beat the PS3 to the punch by releasing a full year earlier. It could boast about also supporting a next-gen video format, even if it ended up being the losing one down the line. It had a lower price, more good games, a more robust online service, and most importantly, it had secured an exclusivity deal with Netflix. It's hard to believe nowadays because Netflix is on every console, every PC, it's on phones, on smart TVs, it's on your fucking fridge, but back in the day, the only non-PC platform to support Netflix streaming was Microsoft's Xbox 360. Oh, you couldn't watch Sony movies on it like Spider-Man or whatever. Yeah, that generation's console war was an especially bitter one as far as console wars go. I wouldn't say it's my personal Vietnam though, Movie Bob. So Microsoft was enjoying this exclusivity deal with Netflix, but Netflix had a different vision of the future. At one point, Netflix wanted to start selling Netflix boxes, which would be like VCRs or DVD players that you hook up to your TV, which would allow you to easily stream Netflix video. In fact, way earlier, Netflix envisioned these boxes as downloading movies overnight to a hard drive so that you could watch them the next day. They had this idea planned before streaming media was an option. But due to their company not being quite so profitable just yet, they decided to switch course, abandoning the Netflix box and instead convincing the owners of other platforms to implement Netflix apps for their hardware instead. And Microsoft was all, yeah, sure, I'll do it, but only if you give me console exclusivity. So, for a while, the 360 was the only place that had a dedicated Netflix app. And then a year later, the Nintendo Wii came out and radically changed video games. Before this point, you were an uber nerd if you actually liked video games. And progressive games journalists today still think so if you don't like them in the politically correct way. But the Wii appealed to the casual market. It's not just that you had a Wii, it's that your parents had a Wii. Old grandmas in retirement homes are still swinging Wiimotes around to this day because it was never about gaming to them, just a great way to get them out of the chair for a while. Everybody had a Wii. My great aunt, who doesn't know what a video game is, has a Wii, and she has Netflix on it. And here's how. Netflix began mailing out these free discs to anybody with both a Wii and a Netflix account. They would later do the same for PS3 owners, and even PS2 owners in some areas of the world. But the Wii started the flood because it was so much more successful than any of its competitors. The Netflix deal with Microsoft was written such that the Xbox 360 would still be the only console with a specialized Netflix app, and that deal was still honored by Netflix. The Netflix discs for the Wii and PS3 simply contained a bit of internet browser software that allowed the consoles to access the PC in-browser version of the Netflix streaming service, without a specialized app. By March 2010, Netflix had expanded to every single console with the use of these workaround discs. And by October of 2010, Netflix's exclusivity deal with Microsoft ran out. Netflix released proper apps for the Wii and the PS3, and all of those free Netflix discs turned into plastic trash that everyone threw out. Ultimately, Netflix would flip the script on the console boys. Their dominate your living room ambitions ended with the failure of services like the Xbox One digital TV tuner and the Wii U's TV remote function. Nintendo really thought this was going to take off, so much so that there's actually a TV button on the Wii U gamepad. I don't think I've ever pressed this thing once. Meanwhile, with services like PlayStation Plus and Xbox Game Pass, these companies are now looking to the Netflix model of one monthly fee to stream unlimited content as something that they want to become. So at this point, things are looking pretty great for Netflix, aren't they? I didn't even talk about the proliferation of quality original content in this era, like House of Cards. That kind of goes without saying. Yeah, occasionally a show would get taken off of Netflix, and that would be annoying, because who wants to sign up to 50 different streaming services to get all the old shows and movies you want to see? You might as well go back to pirating at that point. But despite these hiccups, Netflix kept going strong. Money is pouring in, subs are up, Netflix originals are getting greenlit, and even as competitors like Hulu or Prime Video continue to grow and steal away old archives, and even make their own original content too, Netflix always remained on top. The first real hint, to me, that Netflix wasn't just a waste of money, but in fact was also a giant bureaucracy that was just incrementally failing in the middle of this slow motion collapse, was when Netflix put out Cuties. Yeah, listen, I'm not going to go over that movie again. I did a review of it back when it came out. You all know what it's about. It's about the 11-year-old girls who twerk and are hypersexualized. We all get what's going on here. Go watch that video if you care enough. Also, I realized in retrospect that I really did Mr. Garland injustice here, without really understanding what he was trying to say. He said it in the worst way possible, but damn, I kind of like his stuff now. Sorry, Max. But to me, Cuties was the first major signal that this company was going to begin prioritizing political aims over actually creating a good product or providing a quality service. And that has only continued to be the case. The Cowboy Bebop and Death Note Netflix adaptations are legendarily bad, to the point that the media has continually and inexplicably been running defense for Cowboy Bebop, because we stan a girl who properly covers up her shameful body, I guess. This trend began the Netflix adaptation meme, where manga downgrades to anime, which then downgrades to Netflix. And then there was the whole Dave Chappelle controversy, which I also covered in a previous video, where Chappelle had done 6 stand-up comedy specials for Netflix, and both Netflix's low-level prog staffers and the wider internet were outraged that Chappelle would dare make jokes at the expense of trans people. And then there's the Tinder Swindler, which is basically just the glorification of high-profile gold diggers who just so happened to hit TV a few years ago. And now there's a Netflix show about it. I don't care enough to really dig deep into this one. Gundam did a pretty good explained in autistic detail about it, so go watch that. Now, it's not that everything Netflix touches turns to shit. They did the Castlevania series, and that was pretty good. But there's been enough high-profile misses that, like I mentioned with that Netflix adaptation meme, whenever people hear the name Netflix, they groan in disappointment. 5 years ago, the meme was that Netflix and chilling would lead to an entirely different type of groan. But nowadays, the company, the branding, just seems to have absolutely zero goodwill with the audience. Which leads us to current year. Netflix is officially adding commercials. It's the end of an era for Netflix. While the service has long been praised for its lack of ads and commercials, Netflix is reversing course in the matter. On Tuesday, Deadline reported it would be incorporating ads into the service. Ads on the internet have had their own tumultuous history. But without diving down yet another rabbit hole for this video, let's just say that ads have generally become accepted as a form of evergreen revenue, but most content creators at this point make the majority of their income through more direct contributions, like having a Patreon or a Subscribestar or a merch store. For a while now, the general attitude among viewers is, if you directly support a content creator, you should be able to skip the ads that see videos early or something like that. But platforms like YouTube and Twitch, looking to make a few more bucks, are slowly moving away from that model. And it's no surprise that Netflix is also eyeing up those commercial break fade-outs in their older shows as possible opportunity for more profit. Netflix estimates 100 million households are sharing passwords and suggests that a global crackdown is coming. Today could be a dark day for your ex-boyfriend's brother. Netflix, the world's largest streaming video company, warned that a global crackdown on password sharing is coming. It seems like a serious warning this time. Netflix said that it estimates more than 30 million US and Canadian households are using a shared password to access its content. The company said that more than 100 million additional households were likely using a shared password worldwide. In its quarterly shareholder letter, Netflix acknowledged that it purposely allowed generous out-of-home password sharing because it helped users get hooked on the service. But with competition from Disney, Warner Brothers, Discovery, Paramount Global, NBC Universal, Apple TV, and other streamers eating into its growth, Netflix says it wants the millions of households sharing passwords to start paying. This is another source of a Netflix-related meme, this time revolving around the ex who texts you late at night, asking you for your old Netflix password, even though you broke up 6 months ago, hoping she can keep Netflix and chilling on your dime. Netflix leaned into this meme at one point too, with the official Netflix account tweeting out, "Love is sharing a password" back in 2017. We're never gonna hear that one again, eh? What Netflix doesn't understand is that this is going to have a lot of blowback. They might think it's going to get them a lot more accounts now that these people are hooked on the service. But what's actually going to happen is it will end up being the push for people to abandon Netflix. Whether it's pirating games, pirating movies, sharing or renting, going halvesies on a gift or a car or an apartment, whatever, people generally like being able to opt in with friends to spread costs and share benefits. Movie producers and game developers, and even bands if you want to go back to the Napster days, once viewed each pirated copy of their content as a single lost sale. But that's just not how this thing works. Many people, when given the hard choice of paying full price or going without, or stealing it, they're not going to pay full price, and that's that. Netflix has lost 200,000 subscribers in Q1 and expects to lose another 2 million in Q2. Netflix is canceling animation projects after a highly publicized drop in users. Massive restructuring at Netflix sees talent let go. Meanwhile, Netflix cancels shows that people actually want to watch, like, for example, The Dark Crystal Season 2, only to pump out season after season of fucking Big Mouth. And is there any surprise that the stock is collapsing? Yeah, dude, it was almost at $400 at a few points recently, but it immediately fell off a cliff. And these images are the ones that went viral last week, but it hasn't exactly stopped falling. Here's how it looks today. Oof. I will say one thing though in Netflix's defense. A lot of people right now are currently knocking the Netflix original He's Expecting for being woke garbage. And yeah, looking at the poster, that's what I thought it was too. But it turns out this time it's actually not. This image isn't actually of a trans man who gets pregnant by a trans woman's child or something. He's Expecting is actually adapted from a Japanese comedy drama manga from 2012 called Kentaro Hayama's First Pregnancy, set in an alternate universe where human males biologically have a 10% chance compared to human females of getting pregnant after sex with a woman. In the lore of the story, historically, these men would simply die since they can't actually birth the child, but modern medicine has allowed these men to survive through a C-section. However, there's social stigma surrounding male pregnancy. And like a lot of Japanese media, it's actually pretty not woke. It simply presents various storylines as they would be. One teenager, fearful of the stigma and of his parents' reaction to the fact that he fucked his girlfriend, aborts his child and becomes traumatized by it, destroying his relationship. One woman is jealous that her husband is carrying their second child and mistreats him. It's all the usual J-drama interweaving plotline stuff, and it's not woke at all. In fact, when it is played up for comedy, it's a lot more like the 90s Schwarzenegger comedy Junior, and nobody considered that woke. You know what? I bet if the progs got wise to this movie's existence, it would probably be retrospectively cancelled, wouldn't it?
My body, my choice.
At the same time, I don't blame people for falsely thinking that He's Expecting is woke garbage, because it looks exactly like something that a wokeoid would put out and call stunning and brave. We've seen LGBT agitprop involving pregnant men for a while now. Hell, I remember that one disgusting display of child abuse, where a trans woman made her child suckle at her teat despite it giving no milk, as a way to relieve her dysphoria. Something that was considered to be stunning and brave and taken deathly seriously, and yet was also played up for laughs in the past, this time in Family Guy. So if I knew nothing other than current year politics and you showed me He's Expecting, I would just think, yep, it's Netflix creating woke garbage, because that is all that Netflix is known for now, and that's where the company's going down in flames. From 1934 to 1968, Hollywood was held in the grip of the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code, named after the president of the motion picture producers and distributors of the time. A similar organization, the Comics Code Authority, functioned from 1954 to 2011, and the ESRB has also been the video game equivalent. All three organizations have, or had, the same basic stated goal: to classify media into age groups and prevent the totally obscene from being published at all. Sometimes through government mandate, sometimes through getting private distributors to agree not to sell content that they deem inappropriate. Of these three, the ESRB is probably the least stringent. The only rating that stores won't sell games in is AO. And in order to get that rating, your game generally has to be explicitly pornographic. The only AO games that don't have sexual content are 2003's Peak Entertainment Casinos, where the developer explicitly asked for an AO rating to discourage underage gambling, and 2015's Hatred, which is actually a genocide simulator. The other two regulatory groups, the CAA and the Hays Code, both used their mandate to classify media as a way to censor media. And while the ESRB still survives, because it doesn't exist to censor, its two brothers fell in exactly the same way. Non-compliant competitors began to explode in popularity because, eventually, people got sick of the moral grandstanding in entertainment. They wanted to relax and not be preached at and have this morality constantly pushed upon them. So they began seeking out alternatives, because who wants to be scolded for who they are or what they believe? Who wants to sit down after a hard day's work and get a lecture about the way society should be and how you should behave? Foreign films and comics weren't bound by these codes, and overseas content became popular in the United States for this reason. Eventually, American directors and cartoonists began to openly flaunt the regulations, simply telling the stories they wanted to tell, without the pruning, without the censorship and the preachy bullshit. Some of them lost the support of their industries, but they were ultimately too popular to ignore. And eventually, these regulations collapsed due to mass non-compliance. And here's the funny thing about the story. Both of these regulations existed to be explicitly anti-leftist. The Hays Code was specifically written to target communists and hippies in an age of McCarthyism, with the openly stated goal of the prevention of the alteration of the morality of American society. I don't know how much you know about the 1970s, but that shift in morality happened anyway. The CCA had similar restrictions, being extremely sexually Puritan in its judgments, not allowing any sort of violence or alternative sexuality or drug use, and demanding that all antisocial activities, both criminality and revolutionary politics, be universally portrayed as dysfunctional and pitiable, while all upholders of social order, like cops and judges, must always be portrayed as good. But eventually, cartoonists began to openly flaunt the CCA's regulations. Nowadays, we're seeing the same thing, except the roles have been reversed. The leftists are in charge of the censoring authorities now, and the culture is shifting away from their politics. Leftists have moved into Netflix and other streaming services. They've moved into Hollywood studios. They've moved into game development, and they're now creating media preaching to people how they should be, what they should think, what kind of society they should want. And your average person, they're simply tuning out and finding alternatives, just like they did with the Hays Code and the CCA back then. Netflix is only the most obvious example of a slow-motion collapse in progress, as they buckle under the weight of their own ideology. But the other streaming services and companies that are putting politics ahead of quality will be next on the chopping block. Your average person just doesn't want to be preached at, and the culture will reroute around censorship, even if it has to dip into a gray market to do so, just like it has before. The only thing that the progs have left is to complain until they're blue-faced about how problematic it is that they're being rerouted around. That's why you might see lefty memes like this floating around right now, where the problem that non-leftists have with the current state of media is portrayed as a false dichotomy between the normative and the political. But I would say that any Twitter account that posts this shit has shown the mark of the cope upon them. There's a clear difference between a political drama like House of Cards or Deep Space Nine or something, and a show that preaches its politics to you. The former is political in that politics is a driving force within the narrative. The latter is political in that it's overtly telling the audience what they must believe and how bad of a person they must be if they don't comply. That's the difference. In any case, Netflix seems to be on the way out. Companies survive as shells of their former selves for a very long time. Just look at Blockbuster and Redbox after all. So I don't think that Netflix is about to close their doors anytime soon. But what's in store for them is a long, slow decline across the 2020s before they finally disappear with a whimper. And you know what? That's okay. Better structures, more suited for the new environment, will be built to replace this decaying one. And eventually, those new structures will rot out and be replaced in turn. That's the nature of creative destruction. It's a necessary process in a free society. The only people who complain are the ones who, in the face of another person's freedom, whether it be money or political power, have something to lose.